Okay, we're going to start with indicator 6.2 and talking about the role of women or the changing role of women during this period. Women really worked during World War One because most of the men were off fighting. So they had jobs during that period. But once the soldiers returned, a lot of women would go back to their traditional roles, and some of them taking on traditional roles such as teachers, nurses, secretaries, and operators. Others did some other jobs too, such as domestic servants, factory workers, and sometimes even sweatshop laborers working in these pretty horrendous conditions, usually making cloth or sewing or something along those lines. And finally, women would gain the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. But unfortunately, most of the women relied on their husbands as far as their information went, as far as voting. So it wasn't necessarily that they were really casting their votes the way they thought. They were voting mainly the way their husbands did. All right, next we're going to look at wartime propaganda. And of course, this propaganda was done during World War One, portraying some of our enemies in a pretty bad way, making them look sort of less than human in some cases. But this propaganda was focused on 100% American, that anyone that was an outsider was definitely not our friend. They were out to destroy us, and so on. And this idea, or this feeling, is often referred to as nativism, meaning that you protect the interests of the people that are born in your own country. So in this case, the United States. We also have another term when you have extreme fear or dislike of something. We refer to that as xenophobia. And again, xenophobia means extreme dislike or fear of people from other countries. And in this case, the United States had that after World War One was over with. So immigrants were really targeted pretty bad during this period. So anybody that was not American, anybody that was from another country, they were targeted, mainly because of the wartime propaganda that had been produced during this period. Okay, next we're going to look at an event known as the Red Scare. The Red Scare occurs out of the fear that happens after the Russian Revolution, which took place in 1917. Of course, Russia goes through a violent and bloody revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and a group known as the Bolsheviks. They would take over, seize power from the Tsar, who was the leader of Russia at that time. Um, the Tsar and his entire family would be wiped out, and Russia would become known as the Soviet Union and become a communist nation. Many people in America feared that communism was going to take hold, and they were worried that communism could possibly come to the United States. So, this is pretty much what the Red Scare was. To combat the Red Scare, we see a guy sort of take the lead in seeking out communists that were living in the United States. The guy's name was Mitchell Palmer. He was a U.S. Attorney General, of course, leading the Department of Justice. He would lead a series of raids to find communists. He would have over 4,000 communists arrested during this period. And then he would hold them on bond. So this is the first Red Scare. We're going to talk about another Red Scare after World War II, the fear that communism is going to take over, and there were spies living in the United States. But we'll discuss that when we get to the end of World War II. One movement that would take off in the early 1900s was the temperance movement. This was a social movement which urged the prohibiting of alcoholic beverages. Of course, it backed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited distribution of alcohol, but the 18th Amendment did not prohibit the consumption, so compliance of the 18th Amendment sort of varied. There became illegal sources that would pop up due to the 18th Amendment, and these people, their main goal was to supply alcohol, one of them being, of course, Al Capone. Because there were so many people that still wanted to consume alcohol, we saw the emergence of underground bars, which we call speakeasies, and we also saw the emergence of people that were illegally trafficking alcohol. They were often referred to as bootleggers. The federal nor the state government could enforce the 18th Amendment. They had a hard time with it. Of course, people were still consuming alcohol. They were still making alcohol. And because of all of this, eventually the 18th Amendment is repealed and the 21st Amendment comes into place in 1933, which repealed the 18th Amendment and prohibition. Okay, due to the rise in nativism and, of course, the Red Scare, which we just talked about, this will begin a revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which originally started after the Civil War. But during the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan would have a reemergence. Uh, they had new targets. It wasn't just African Americans this time, it was Catholics, Jews, and the radicals that were living during this period. Many of the Ku Klux Klan saw themselves as moral regulators, thinking they were doing the right thing. They targeted bootleggers and gamblers to sort of, you know, make sure that they were doing this moral regulation that they were claiming. But most of the KKK leaders were revealed as being scandalous, very corrupt, and it undermined their moral claims. One of the guys that is known for not being such a moral regulator like the Ku Klux Klan liked to portray was a guy named David Stevenson. He was the Grand Dragoon of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana. Under his leadership, the Ku Klux Klan rose to a membership of over 300,000 during David Stevenson's time as the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. He even boasted that he was the law in Indiana, but eventually it was found out that he was a severe alcoholic, he was a sexual deviant, he'd been accused of rape, and he degraded and humiliated women, and eventually he was arrested. So this claim of moral regulation by these Ku Klux Klan members was sort of a contradiction. The Ku Klux Klan would still carry on, really reaching its peak in the 1960s during the civil rights movement as well. So the Ku Klux Klan would continue, but begins its reemergence during the 1920s. Okay, during the 1920s, religion and science would come to differences and come to blows with the idea of fundamentalism. And what fundamentalism was it was the belief or the literal belief or truth of the Bible. And you follow everything that the Bible says. The problem was that a lot of people began to start to believe in another idea that was created by science, which was Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. Darwin's theory of evolution challenged the idea of creationism, which is, a fundamental belief of what is taught in the Bible, that God created man. And of course, evolution teaches that man evolved from apes. And this eventually comes to a head with a trial known as the Scopes monkey trial. In Tennessee, a biology teacher decided to teach the theory of evolution, which the state of Tennessee forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. Um, he defied that law. He was arrested, and eventually the ACLU would come to his defense. And what eventually happens is that he is going to be fined, and really not much changes. But this was a well-known court case. It didn't really resolve anything, but both sides are going to claim victory in this important case.